Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 459 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Chénard, Julia Galloway, and Ochtli. In our interview, we talk about practical sustainability and the ways that you can lessen your studio's environmental impact. Julie and Che are members of the NCECA Green Task Force, which has many resources on this topic. So if you're interested, check out their website. That's NCECAGTF.com. This discussion was recorded live in Cincinnati last week as a part of this year's NCECA conference. The podcast room that we hosted was a huge success, so we wanted to thank you all for coming and being in attendance for that. We'll be releasing all of the episodes that were a part of the Brickyard Network over the next couple weeks, so make sure to refresh your podcast feeds and check us out at brickyardnetwork.org. Before we get to this week's episode, I wanted to announce that I'll be during the Clay Center of New Orleans' upcoming exhibition, Less is More. This juried exhibition is open to ceramic vessels, sculptures, and wall-mounted works, and celebrates earthenware clay and low-fire surface techniques. The application deadline is April the 15th, so visit nolaclay.org/call for entries to apply today. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. To get started, I want to say my name is Ben Carter, and I've been a podcaster for quite a long time. I started Tales of a Red Clay Rambler in 2012. And it's been one of the greatest honors in my life to be able to share a stage and share a microphone with some of my greatest heroes. And I really think that the recording of our collective history is important. So I'm really proud of NCECA that they have supported us with this podcast room this year. Again, if you see an NCECA board member, thank them, because this is such a great way to meet with you all, the audience, as well as to disseminate the information we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to go ahead and have my co-panelists introduce themselves, starting with Marianne at the end there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to be here. I'm Chénard from Montreal, Quebec, and I'm one of the hosts of the Kiln Sitters, our great Canadian show. Our mandate is really to talk about Canadian ceramic and invite people that can share their stories. So I invite you, if you haven't listened, to join us. And I'm co-host with Brendan Salish-Tang and Carol Hepp. So glad to be here. Awesome.
Hi, my name's Julia Galloway, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm a teacher at the University of Montana and also have an active studio practice in Missoula, and I'm excited about being on this panel because for the last couple of years my work has really shifted to be addressing sort of impending environmental situations. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and thanks for coming.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ochtli. Super excited to be here and to see this room so full of people. I am an at-home ceramicist. I've been doing that for about 6 years and figuring out how to balance the vocation with being an artist and also a healthcare worker. So I'm also very excited to be here with you all today and share what we've got to say about the Green Task Force.
Yeah, so let's give Che a round of applause. So our topic for today is taking an environmental approach to making, but we're also going to be talking a lot about NCECA's Green Task Force, which has been active, I believe, since the early 2000s. So I wanted to actually start asking the panelists to talk about when they had somewhat of an environmental awakening, when they felt like they needed to take action, because that's really the name of the game. We can give you information, and you probably get information in the news or wherever you get your sources, but the important thing is, like, when do you want to take the action? So any of you guys, if you'd like to jump in and talk about that.
Yeah, that's interesting because for me, the story starts like I'm born on the farm. So like I was always close to food. How do you grow food? You gather food, like respective of that and how much work is put into it. And after I did my BFA, I started my business as a production potter, working mold making. And my goal was really to help people consume better and like be proud of local Canadian ceramic, and working with porcelain, try to elevate a little bit our objects. And I was making a lot of work that was reflecting what was happening around me in the landscape, and talking about the importance of all that. And later on, we're going to talk about different aspects of accessibility, but I had a back injury that actually forced me to take a break from that and rethink of my practice. And I was lucky to go back to school, but also to give myself time to rethink about that. Like, how do I bring attention to issues of climate change and all this? And I just decided that to really look at how much waste I was producing in my studio and make a physical objects out of it. So I created this giant cube, and it was during an MFA, so you can understand how much waste you can produce. So I recycle everything, and I did that, and it was huge. And I was like, okay, my goal from now is going to be to really reduce this. And how do I do this? Like, how do I step out of my comfort zone? And I was excited about the medium of water that's always present into clay, and that's become part of the cycle of making. And from that, I end up working with just really raw clay and just going more, letting the elements acting in the work and working more installation based and directly outside in our environment. So a huge switch, but it really came to that making thousands of objects a year and be attentive to the material. So the material brought me there, really. So that's a bit why I'm addressing this issue now. But what about you, Julia? You got a lot to share.
So I had a really fabulous career as a studio potter in addition to teaching. And when I turned 50, I wanted to do I could sort of shift my practice into something else a little bit. And at that time, I was sort of horrified by the sort of rapid diminish of species. I was starting to really notice it and pay attention to it. And I had read that half of the freshwater clams and mussels in North America are endangered. And when it was like 5 or 10, I could kind of handle it, but half just felt completely problematic to me. So I started working on this project of making commemorative plates and now urns for endangered species of the United States. And so I'm working on this project, and I think, well, like, what am I doing that contributes to this? And I better put my money where my mouth is. If I'm going to be all up here like endangered this, endangered that, I better make sure that my practice is supporting basically the content of my work. So I got involved with the Green Task Force about 3 years ago to try to really investigate and research more environmentally thoughtful ways of working in the studio and what I could change about my own practice that would support one of the some of the content I'm concerned about.
So when I was 16, I actually got hired for the Forest Service, and I was working under an ecophysiologist. And so someone who studies essentially physiology of ecosystems. And what I found, and I worked in forests all the way from the kind of the California-Mexico border all the way up to the Oregon border. And the ecophysiologist specifically focused on those habitats and specifically pine forests that were on the edge of these kind of climate shifts. And she had me working up data for that. And so I was actually getting to see on a single tree level the impact to these forests. And so that's kind of when I started to realize that the choices that we make as, an individual or an institution are tangible, and I would be able to see them physically on a graph. And that was kind of my introduction. I went ahead and then started the Green Club in high school.
Nice.
Which we called the Agricultural Society because I liked plants. And of course, everyone thought it was for something else because we were in high school. But then that's continued kind of to, what's now been a 16-year journey or 15-year journey to figure out what my place is in the world. And I've been really delighted to kind of most recently in my ceramic practice find out what that means to me.
One of the things that we talked about in the kind of pre-conversation that we had is that this topic is very overwhelming, and sometimes data can freeze you. Like when Julia's talking about that the muscles, half of the muscles are endangered, like that's a statistic that like stops me in my tracks, and I think like, oh God, what am I going to do? And one of the principles that we started talking about was start where you are. Mm-hmm. And so, Julia, if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I remember you mentioned that like we don't want this to be a guilt thing. We're not going to like try to guilt everyone into changing, but there is something to be said with taking the small changes that you can change every day, and those will add up to bigger societal change. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that I just loathe is when I have a problem or we're discussing a problem and there's no sort of solution or positive idea around it. I just loathe that. It's just completely demoralizing to me. So in thinking about studio practices, some things I've done, especially as a teacher, is where I can be really quite effective. And some is lowering our firing temperature. Is that what you're asking me? Things like this?
Sure.
Okay.
This is perfect.
We want to know.
There's a couple of things that every year at school we try to conquer or address one thing. And honestly, we can do one thing. And now it's been 4 years, so we've done 4 things. But we couldn't have done 4 things in 1 year, right? So some is we brought our firing temperature down, and some is that does use less electricity. But really what it's doing is that we're not having to replace our equipment as often. So we're actually consuming less, right, in both areas. Another is changing our clay bodies to be just regional materials as much as possible, and changing our assignments to actually fit our clay bodies. Changing our students' assignments so they can actually fit the assignment in their dorm room, so they're throwing out less, and having some projects that are more gift oriented. So over the holidays, maybe they'll be making gifts for their family, as part of an assignment. So trying to think in a broader way like that. Also, we've really changed how we're using water in the studio. And so students, when they're throwing, they have their water buckets. Now they keep those water buckets and slowly refill those up instead of just dumping them out every time. So I think for us, it's just been these little nibbles we've been able to do again and again. And actually, it's adding up in kind of a wonderful way. I do think that, feeling bad doesn't help anything, right? It's just like freezes you. And half the clams in the United States, like that just is horrible. That just sounds horrible. So then I think that with that, if there's some action, then you feel a little better, and then you can do a little more, So I feel very strongly that people just can find what they can do, and you do that, and then later you can maybe do a little more. But to kind of shed that horrific feeling, I think so important.
And thank you for talking about education, because that's something that I started. I'm also an instructor at Concordia University, and I teach introduction ceramics. So it's like we're learning all the basic, all. And I asked them to keep all the ways during the whole year that we were together. And at the end, we do a last project. And it's fantastic to see how creative the students are with understanding that this doesn't have to be thrown away. And actually a student made a whole video how to recycle clay, and we used it. So it's like they get involved into how, and yeah, that's a way. Maybe I like what you say, it's becoming creative, I think, too. It takes a lot of the load off. Mm-hmm.
This idea of boundaries being an entryway into creativity is interesting. I talk to so many artists throughout each year on my own show, and what I found is that the artists that make the most and flourish the most actually have pretty specific boundaries. Like they say, I want to work within this temperature range. I want to make pots in this way on this idea. So I like the idea also that the boundaries that will help us all be more sustainable actually could be the thing that pushes creatively forward in the studio. So I just wondered if y'all have any thoughts about that, like thinking about environmentalism. I mean, it's what you've already said, but not as a negative boundary, but as in a parameter to excel within. And I guess really the lower temperature glazes and clays, that's I think about what you've done with Cone 6 soda. When you came to ceramics, I don't think anyone was doing, I don't know. Was anyone doing it? But within that, you've done so much because it's a boundary. It's Cone 6 in an atmospheric kiln. You can do a lot with it.
I think what's interesting is so I started working at a mid-range in 1989. And, 1989. And some of it was because all of the high fire glazes were all named Leech White and Randy's Green and in Hamada Green, and I was I'm not that person at all. I'm this total loudmouth, sassy girl, and what am I using Hamada Green for? Do you know? I was and I just felt Cone 10 was so crowded. There was no room up there for Julia's Green, So I started working at Cone 6, sort of just in rebellious act, and then I figured out the firing is shorter and the shelves never warp. How cool is that? And so it started off just as this good sort of challenge. And then now over time, it's really become sort of a more thoughtful environmental decision. But it did sort of start as I needed something to push against, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd had enough of the history in front of me, so I thought I better figure out what to do right there. We do one thing in our school where the students build a 6-foot vessel in pairs the first 3 weeks of school. And so then they learn how to build and handle clay very, very quickly. They have to do 3 inches a day, right? Right, up. And then we collapse them down, we break it up, and then that's the clay for their semester. And nice. So it's this really fabulously contained thing, right? And then all of their learning comes out of their first project in this kind of great way. And that assignment was from Scott Chamberlain in Colorado. Got to give credit where it's due. But talk about working off of a boundary. That's just been fabulous.
Yeah, and that's also because boundary but relationship. I love how you say, because it's you build this, you're so proud, and then you break it down and you already have a relationship with the material. That's awesome. That's actually how I, in my new work, I have a lot of boundaries actually, and I see it as something really exciting because I work only with natural material that are either modified or exploited by humans, but so beeswax and salts and all materials that are in glaze, but I isolate them. So it's always, and I work outside. So if I have to play with the weather and I have to visit a place multiple times. So these boundaries, they're constantly there, but it slows down my work. I have to work way different than when I had a studio and I could just walk in there and have an idea and do, but there's something exciting about these boundaries. It's okay, it asks me to be more patient, to be more attentive, and also to slow down and choose, which is, I think, a good way to, I think being attentive to what we use helps for becoming more sustainable in many ways.
Yeah, one of the things about sustainability in your work, Marianne, is thinking about when you're working in an environment, as you're bringing ceramic materials out into the world to do the sculptures, to do the works, how those materials, when you use them in nature, affect that ecosystem. So can you talk about the role research plays in that? How do you figure out how to step lightly, how to leave less trace in the way you work.
That's actually was a huge challenge. And this work happened really spontaneous because I know maybe some of you will understand, I did my MFA during a pandemic. So suddenly I had no studios and it became my minivan. And it just happened kind of spontaneous that I ended up working outside because I was doing representation of nature. And then suddenly I'm like in it. And I was reading books about new materialism and material agency. And so it really keyed in. But I had to talk to biologists because the first thing I did is I refused to move dirt or take from the land. Because that was a huge decision. People would say, "Oh, you're making land art." I'm like, no. I'm not Smithson. I'm not going to move dirt. I'm not going to. So I am bringing something that is foreign to a place. So to do that, we all know that when you're a foreigner, you have to listen. You have to walk in, and we have a beautiful word in French, say apprivoiser, and I can't translate it yet because it means taming, but it's not taming. You have to kind of be attentive. And I had talked to biologists. So if I'm bringing kaolin in like northern Quebec, where kaolin it's not natural from there, it is a foreign material. So how much do I bring in, and without wrecking the environment? So it becomes like that acknowledgement that I am not native to that place, and I'm becoming in a relationship with. So that's like, it's always a challenge. Like, and I have to do a lot of research and talk to people. But I think that's something that really for me was important when I started working, it was back home where I knew the landscape very well, and when I moved back to the US after the pandemic, we were allowed to move back. I was like, whoa, I'm not from there, like I don't know this space. So it was like, how do you ask permission to work? So that I had to like visit the place and become familiar with the space, and it's actually really exciting to just acknowledge that you're an outsider and to learn to work in these places. And so we'll see how it goes. But definitely research a lot. But it makes it good. I pit fire now, and I just like make giant. Yeah, it's really exciting.
It kind of takes me back to the work you were doing in high school, actually, with working with the forestry. In your experience with that, was there any crossover with scientists looking at artists or vice versa for solutions? Because I feel like that is a genre now. Mm-hmm. Like, I know I can't recall people's names, but I'm thinking about people that work intimately with scientists in ecosystems. Did that seem familiar?
Not at the time there. And, I don't recall, the ecophysiologists we worked with, we never really addressed that. Yeah, I think where we did bring wisdom, and I think, this was 10 years ago now, and she was doing this work 15 years ago, kind of what, Marianne, you're talking about with respecting the land and who we talk to, is although now it is mandated on our federal level, 10 years ago wasn't, but she was consulting tribal leaders at the time to figure out basically how the forest was doing, because they had the intimate knowledge there. Because often lands, federal national forest land is adjacent to tribal land.
When I started the Endangered Species Project and I went and I met with the scientists at school, there's a big science program at my school, and I told them what I wanted to do, and they were like kind of interested, really. And they said, well, you should just do the cute species because those get all the attention. And I was like horrified. I was like, no, I have to do the bugs. And my sister's a botanist, so I have to do all the plants, And finally, they kind of heard me out. And then Chad, he finally said to me, well, look, we are great at figuring out the information, but we're terrible at letting people know what we've learned. Mm-hmm. So if you can go and tell people what we've learned, if you can show what we're talking about, that would be great. And so that's really been kind of fabulous, that I can make something visible in a way that's appealing to look at, and it makes it more effective.
Yeah, think about the role of volume in your work. I remember at a Bray show, maybe 2 years ago, there was plates on the wall that related to fish that were endangered. And I was watching the work, and they were standing in front of the wall, and there was something about the multiplicity of the plate that actually drove the content home. So can you talk about how you think about repetition and form as a way to educate the audience?
Well, I think with my current project, what I think is so profound is that with endangered species, the trick is you don't see them, right? So you don't even really realize that they're gone until somebody sort of points it out. So by working in multiples, I'm showing you what's gone now in effort to make something relatively unseen seen. And it was initially really inspired by the AIDS quilt and how once it became so evident at how many people had been passing because of AIDS, suddenly there had to be some research done. So a little bit, I'm trying to lovingly put it in the public's face, what's going on. And I did have a show with species in them. They were all species that were extinct in the Great Lakes. And I had a show with some clouds because I wanted fish to have a place to live in heaven. So I thought that would be great if I could make some cloud plates like heaven that the fish could swim in. So I think even though that is really far out compared to what I'm doing now, I love the idea of what fish heaven would look like.
Well, I want to bring explicitly the Green Task Force into this conversation. Mm-hmm. So would you be willing to talk, Che, just about the task force as a whole and then why you got involved?
Oh, no, I feel like the least qualified person.
No,
So I'm one of the, I think, newer members at this point, but I've been working with the Green Task Force for about a couple of years. And so the Green Task Force really is, it's a collection of some amazing individuals with all their strengths in different areas. And we've come together collaboratively to kind of address some of the concerns around environmental and sustainability and equity as well, specifically within our clay practice. How'd I do, Julia?
That sounds like what we're doing. We meet once a month, and we're just trying to figure out. Mostly, we're about trying to collect information and get it out there, because there's a lot of sort of random bits of information, but about how to sort of shift our creative practice to being environmentally and culturally sensitive and responsible without suddenly, it's frustrating. People sometimes feel like, well, forget it. I'm not doing anything then. And I'm going to stop making anything, or I'm just going to make everything I want. It's like kind of like when you give up on a diet or something, So I think the Green Task Force, we're trying to kind of quietly get some information out there. And we have a fabulous website. And so next, what I hope we can start working with is distributors, because they really have a ton of information, and they could help us find each other, and they could help us let us know about our materials and our resources. And maybe there's some way they could work with bulk hiring, so we could bulk materials, so we could maybe have less containers moving around. I'm not sure. But we just want to sort of be a voice for these concerns. And we're really spread all over in urban and rural and all across the United States and in Europe.
Yeah, and I know from talking to other Green Task Force members that it's a heavy lift to try to start working with environmentalism as an idea. But I love that each person kind of works on slightly different things, bringing their resources to the collective. So if you go to NCECAGTF.com, I believe, or maybe it's .org.com. Yeah. You can go literally click on the resources tab, and you'll be able to find a lot more scientific analysis than what we're going to give you today. But just by show of hands, are there any other task force members here today?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. So afterwards, if you guys have questions, if you could ask Che or Julie or the other fine folks in how you could get involved, that would be great.
Yeah, I have to bring in this subject because I'm actually a victim of this. I hurt myself from working too much in the studio over the 8 years that I was British Barker. And I have a question for Che, because I read the book by Robert Harrison, and there's a whole chapter in the book, it's Sustainable Ceramics. And there's a whole chapter on sustainability of the maker and the body. And I know you're a care worker. So I was wondering what's your thought about caring as a way in which we can approach a concept of sustainability?
Yeah. We had our pre-meeting conversation,
Yeah.
and so I was thinking, I'm like, how am I going to answer that question? But I actually did a little digging into myself, actually. So I actually revisited when I first started ceramics and why I did it.
Yeah.
And it was actually because of my healthcare job. So at the time, I still work in a burn center, but at the time I was working at a burn center at a different position. And the kind of variety of experiences that I saw there were greatly impactful. A lot of emotional labor and energy. And so at the end of the day, I didn't really have a lot for myself. And, I'll get to the point, I promise. But this really led to a reflection of that I actually needed to prioritize myself in order to have more to give. And that meant that from a sustainability perspective, there we go, there's the word, I needed to be sustainable to myself. And part of that is actually, I'm going to call her out, sorry. Liz Duarte was my first ceramic instructor, and she did a great job as my first ceramic class, bringing in concepts that she had learned from other ceramicists about practices to be sustainable in the studio. And that really reinvigorated that self-sustainability, but then also sustainability within my job. But then also I realized that now I had some more energy to specifically give and care for the Green Task Force. So I began to use, again, those same skills that I had learned in my healthcare position. I was able to translate them now to sustainability within this context as well, which really is just much more fulfilling than just any one of those things by itself.
It's so great. Like the Green Task Force is so much information, so much information, and it's fabulous what you're doing with all this research. And I'm like being the person in the crowd that, it's like in the food industry, like I started looking at organic or how do I consume food? Like I could, sometime I like caught myself looking at in the egg section for 5 minutes, trying to decide like what kind of, am I going to go local, organic, like what to do? So I know probably some of you in there, like, how do we start? Like it could be really overwhelming. I think you touched on it a bit earlier, Julia, but what would be your advice for someone that just in like the first step in the studio to maybe address this sustainability? Like how do we look? Like how do we take the first step in?
I think it's pretty interesting because so much of that is based on your personality, right? Like I remember once my roommate read through the whole Green Task Force website and she said, well, I'm not going to bisque less, but I can drive less.
Nice.
So I think that was really her personality. Like she was not in any way going to compromise her studio practice, but she's really willing to give up other things. So that seemed like that was so eye-opening to me. Like, oh, I get that, right? But I think if you're really, I would first start like with water consumption. It's such an easy thing to look at. Like, what's my water so I would just start there and sort of see. And then I would sort of branch out from there about what makes sense. I know one thing I'm really working on now is showing locally, so I'm not shipping pots all over the place. And my school would really love me to show in LA or New York, but I keep making this case, like it's more important for me to show in Montana, actually, So I think some is looking at your studio practice and see where you could sort of, make a little shift. And then it gets very easy. And then another little shift over here or over there. But I think that thing when she said, but I can really drive less, that was really eye-opening to me. That actually I would give up a ton of other stuff before I would give up soda firing.
Well, what you're saying actually reminds me, in the 90s, that every bumper sticker of a progressive person was think globally, act locally. You guys probably even remember these bumper stickers. They were everywhere. Every Subaru in America had that sticker. But there's a practical wisdom to that. I mean, it's interesting to me how the crossover with sustainability and indigenous practice, the indigenous practice is almost always pointing towards local experience and involvement. And I think, like, how practical is that? It's just so practical. And I think one of the things when you're talking about this career, like I'm looking out there, I see some young students, like it's often you might be thinking like, I got to go get a job where I teach workshops and I show everywhere and I do this and I do this and I do this. But I don't know, like, is that really the goal that's the best for you? I've been talking to people a lot about that lately. It's like, what is the goal in your life that fits your moral compass? And maybe showing in LA fits your moral compass, but maybe it doesn't. So maybe having the exhibition at the local place or wherever. So I think there's so much individual choice with this, but doing something is better than doing nothing. So I did want to move towards audience questions. So if you guys have any questions, we would love to be a resource. So if you could get up and ask into the mic, that would be great.
Yes, please. And it is a little bit scary at first, but as soon as you speak in the mic,
I'll break the ice
okay.
here.
Thank you.
I was lucky enough to kind of start my ceramic career in a very conscientious studio that was very aware of how much water was being used. But one thing that did always kind of bother me is that I knew we were throwing out a fair amount of slop. So when we were slopping out these clay traps or these sink traps that we were using in the studio, there was quite a bit of waste generated from that. And I didn't know if maybe you personally used or knew of someone that had kind of come up with a unique way to reduce that amount of waste coming out of community studios.
Is this slop like in the trap under the sink?
Yes.
The kind of smelly part?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Deb Schwarzkopf has a wonderful video out about making pavers out of the slop under the sink. And then Brandy Cooper, almost all of her work is made out of slop, or she doesn't use any first-use materials, which is like pretty interesting, right? But I think those pavers, boy, they're like pretty popular. And, I looked at the pavers. We're not going to do that in Montana. There's too much snow. But I was thinking that we could make bricks that would be bookends. So I think like a really sexy looking brick, I can get behind that.
Hi.
Hi.
I work at a distributor. And so like in the face of all the consumerism, which is my job, I also am thinking about the responsibility that we have to the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you bridge that gap? Like, that's my question.
Can I ask you a question before you leave? How much do you guys talk about that at the distributor? Like, is that a part of the conversation?
Yes. Like, we try to do green packaging with our shipping, and we recycle all of our classroom clay, and that's what I'm so sorry. We recycle all of our classroom clay, and that the students keep using that over and over again. But I feel like that's kind of the line. And then with all the materials things that are going on right now, save the earth. Use the earth.
Is there anyone else in the audience that has come across any solutions that they feel like for either local community centers or distributors?
I have a lot to ask the distributors, but let's give somebody else a chance first.
I think if local community centers build that into their systems, so if they make space for it, it is just encouraging to their clay community and it's also showing that that's important. So if you make it an afterthought, then it's a very low expectation for the people that are coming to you to try to integrate that into their system. So if it's something from the very beginning that this is important to us and that we need to create space, we need to create the consideration for what happens to this material when we're done with it, then you're creating a legacy. So we have to start sooner rather than later. It has to be important.
So I think distributors, if they could take the clay boxes back, the clay bags back, the underglazed jars back, fill them up again. If my tiny health food store can give me 4 kinds of bulk shampoo, seems to me like we could get some black underglaze instead of
tap.
But I think that that's a big ask.
Yeah.
That's going to be a big loss for them in the beginning. So I think we have to show some like product loyalty, to really support that, because that would be really tough in the beginning. And the distributors sort of know like who's buying what, right? Mm-hmm. And so they have an ability to look around and sort of see how to make that happen. But I think they also really need our support, right? Mm-hmm. I did talk with a distributor, and they wouldn't take the underglazed jars back because it was so much water to wash them. And I was like, I'll send mine dirty. Like, that's fine. I'm a clay. But somehow I have to really accept what they send me then. So it is a two-way street. But I do think that for the most part, studio artists are doing about as much as what's out there is about as much as they can do until distributors sort of help us figure out how to get materials maybe processed more locally. And I'd like to know where my clays are from and where they're getting processed. Mm-hmm. And if I have a choice between buying this clay that was here or this clay that was here, I can make that into an environmental choice because usually it's only a few cents difference, right? Things like that. Or like when you're buying an electric kiln, you can get a wider wall or a narrower wall. And the wider wall's not that much more, but you save 15% on electricity. But I sort of had to ask to get that information. Mm-hmm. And boy, that'd be a great selling point, you know. So I would love to work more closely with industry. If anybody out there wants to work with me, I would love that.
If I can hop in for just a second, I wanted to mention, because I also kind of split my time working for a retailer. And something that we have done that has greatly impacted, we believe, our footprint is working with our distributors and requesting less back orders. So I don't want to get everything that, you know, if we've got a 100-item order, instead of getting one shipment with 50 items, another shipment with 10, another shipment with 10, that asking that they hold that entire order until it's filled. That way we know it's going to be one pallet, it's one transportation. It reduces our cost too and helps reduce the footprint of that shipping and transportation.
Hello. My question is a totally different path. Just curious your thoughts on the environmental impact between using an electric kiln and a gas kiln.
Really depends on where you live.
Yeah.
Honest to God. Like the electricity in Montana comes from coal, so it's better if we fire with wood. But in LA, it's a pretty good idea if I fire with electric. So I always want this silver bullet. Like I want like this thing like check, check, check. Yeah, it's just not like that. So a lot of it depends on where you live and also the quality of your equipment. If you have a really leaky electric kiln, it might be better to fire with gas, you know. Or if you have a blow, you know, maybe that's going to, you know, blows are unbelievably efficient. If we could get an American-style blow that was affordable, that could be a game changer. So that was just a call out to somebody to do that. But I wish there was a silver bullet for you, but it really based on where your electricity comes from. You can call your electric company, by the way. How cool is that?
Well, you mentioned Blau, and I wanted to piggyback on that. I interviewed Jeff Chown, who I think he's here downstairs in the expo, and we were talking about efficiency of kilns, and Blaus are 80% more efficient. And it's because they have a compressed refractory. It's a technological upgrade. And occasionally that happens. Like there are actual technological upgrades that affect our direct community. But they're expensive. Blaus are more expensive. And let's say you have a high school. Like, is your high school really going to get a Blau? Probably not.
Kind of 80% more expensive.
That is true.
They are.
Sorry.
Okay. Hi. Kind of piggybacking off of the conversation before, I'm a product design student and a fine art student at UC. So I do a lot of research with supply chain management. And in the product design field, there is a company called Loop. And pretty much they'll have a product that you use all the time and they'll use reusable packaging and you send it back. So if you give that example to the distributors and show how that helps the marketability, I think that could be a great way to piggyback. Now, I don't know about how it would work with shipping those materials because I know that has more limitations, but it could be a cool jumping off point.
Are you saying LOOP?
Yeah, Loop. And then the parent company is TerraCycle, TerraCycle. Excuse me. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. That's awesome.
Hi, I'm Stacy. I wanted to piggyback on if they could recycle the bags for clay. Like I have so many plastic bags of clay and I feel so guilty about throwing those away. So some answer to that would be amazing. But my question is, I've been playing around a lot with making glazes. I have so much glaze that I didn't like and I don't know what to do with all that leftover glaze. And if you have any ideas about what to do, like I don't want to throw it down the drain, would I dry it out, throw it in the garbage? glaze the bookends out of the slop. The slop and the
Well, this is a good question, and this is something that comes up a lot on For Flux's Sake. We just had a taping of this actually, and I'm the producer for that, and so I look at the emails that come in with the questions, and we get asked this question now maybe once a month. And so what that tells me is this is a community issue, that we have not come up with a good solution, and I think. Matt and Rose have talked, and Kathy have talked about that there are practical things that can be made into other things. Some people are firing it in crucibles, essentially like high refractory, so you're making almost like a glass product that then can be used usually in outdoor gardening situations. But I'm giving you an answer that says this is a much bigger question. So I hope, is there anyone in the audience that has had any other solutions for this type of thing that they would like to mention?
Audience first.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
I don't necessarily have an answer, but I would say I own a studio, and if I had anybody reach out to me and say that they had glaze that they didn't want, I would buy it off of them.
Exactly.
So, reach out to community studios that are around you.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I wanted to bring out. It's like we're lucky to have social media, to have like always there's so many pop-ups of groups of ceramicists coming and just like say, I have that glaze, it doesn't fit my production anymore, who would like it? And I would start with local sharing and then eventually go on. So thank you. That's exactly the same time.
I would say on that topic too, like I started mixing my own glazes and making my own, not using the commercial ones. And I have a mystery bucket and I just keep adding to it. And when it gets to a color point that I like it, then I start using it. And then I start again. And I've got multiple glaze dump buckets that, I use. And that's one way to do it. And I actually got that from a raku teacher that I had in college, and that's what he would do. And that mystery raku glaze was the best.
Exactly. It's actually true. When I teach glaze technology, we keep all the little 100 grams and make a tout ski in French, everything that's there. And it's lovely. It becomes like your class glaze, or like something you've done. If you work at the same temperature, no problem. So it's a really good trick. Thanks. No, you can't remake it. That's the beauty of it. It's the moment. It was that weekend where you learn initiation to glaze technology.
I love that too. That students might, if you're in Marianne's this specific Marianne's class, that they will leave with a mug that is all glazed the same, and then nothing else is the same. It actually could be like a bonding moment.
Yeah.
Hey, just to kind of circle towards like thinking about education and how we approach education. And ceramics is a technical process-based material where we have to practice to kind of get it through and to understand. And I'm always trying to puzzle out, like with throwing classes, there's, the cylinders, or sculpture classes, they're building their figures and things are breaking or whatever. But it's, we have to put it through these stages to kind of see, to get the finished product. But these are like things that we're practicing with. And I'm wondering, like, how do we get around that? I love that idea of making the 6-foot sculpture and then that's your clay for that, for the rest of that semester. And sort of, that's a really brilliant idea. But how do, it feels like there is like a fundamental change around ceramic education. Because it's like, I feel like learning ceramics is like learning a new instrument. You have to practice all the time. And that's what gets some of us in it. So, but how do we work with that within the material itself? Not that you would have like a surefire answer. The silver bullet, that's what I'm looking for, Julia.
Yeah, I really don't have a silver bullet on this one because you just have to put miles on your hands, right?
Yeah.
I did hear a colleague say that he put off firing for a long time. And as time went on, the students' work got better and they looked at their earlier work and they were less interested in keeping it. And then they had skin in the game. It was up to them rather than me saying, like, let's not fire those hockey pucks.
Yeah. Or I did my MFA in an institution where we could access really big kiln. And right away I walked in and I was like, why big? It was just, but I understand why, like that relation to the body and the bigger size. And like when you get there, you have access to this kiln, everyone gets excited. And like, I end up not firing anything big, but a lot of people did. And I think if you're going to give a facility that gives that, show people how to make grog with the things they don't keep, like have a crusher, try to recycle this and make grog out of it. Or just like, also, I think it comes for education. Like as a person, if you're aware, I'm going to come back to food, but I buy only local meat where I know the farmer. Like if you're aware of all these things, students will make that decision, and they're going to be careful a bit more with their clay or ask this question. So that's a bit how, as an educator, is if you start from the roots and have these conversations with your students, they're gonna make the decision to also bring the solution to you. And they might think a lot about it before they start making something big. It's good to know how structurally things holds on together, but what do we make? But do we need to fire it? Do we just recycle it? Do we make grog out of it? But yeah, I think it's having these conversations with the students helps a lot.
I think some of this too is methodology of teaching. Like do things need to be fired, I think is part of this. But Tina Gebhardt, a professor somewhere in Pennsylvania, I was talking to her about how they use 3D printing, and she actually would teach them 3D printing before throwing, because she could then teach them about good form and bad form. It was almost like putting miles on the students' eyes instead of their hands, so that then by the time they got to wanting to make things, they had a discerning opinion. And I think so much of like early ceramics is not knowing what you want, not knowing what you like. So I like this idea that they could, and I think sometimes they wouldn't even 3D print it. They would just design it digitally, and then they would critique the digital design. And I know that doesn't work for every university, but it flipped the script for me. Like method from a teaching standpoint, I would never have thought of that. So I thought that was interesting.
You remind me that actually I had my first ceramic class ever was with Linda Sorming. And the first class she said, that if you fire something, it stays on earth forever. And I was like, whoa. And then I think every time now I teach and I quote her, because it's something that I was like, yeah, that is archival. Like this is, I better really, and my parents' home's from pretty ugly first ceramic that I did, and it's okay. But, you learning, but it stayed with me. So I think, it's important to talk about that archival part and making the choices. So, yeah.
I think that came up as well during one of our talks earlier this week with Gino and Chanda when they were doing kind of a community gathering. And one of the strategies that I heard from one of the audience members was that he kept mugs over a period of time, and he would actually sit with his students and they would have tea time a couple times during that class, and that they would sit together, but they weren't allowed to pick the same mug each time. And it was a range of levels so they could see what, an early mug looked like versus in a more advanced. So they'd be able to kind of, again, that discernment.
Hi. My name is Nicole. I'm a MFA student at Arizona State. I recently, 6 months ago, relocated from Vancouver, where I'm from, to Arizona to my master's. And it was on my journey driving down to Arizona that I started to realize what I was doing and the impact that my medium was having on the planet and my practice and everything. It really shifted my way of thinking about being a ceramic sculptor and what I could do. Another thing I noticed when I got to where I was going was that the drastic shift in weather prevented people from recycling materials in Arizona. Our summers get to be, I don't know how to tell temperature in American, but like 45, 48 degrees in the summer. Yeah, it was 118 when I arrived in Phoenix, and it was shocking. So I quickly realized that the weather was preventing people from recycling materials, and it got me thinking about what I could do to get students more access to materials that maybe didn't have money for clay or glazes, things like that. So Sam Chung and Susan Biner connected me with the universities and schools in our area. I was able to kind of drive around and see who wanted to donate clay to us, and we could use our equipment, our manpower to recycle clay in the valley in Phoenix, and it really helped to kind of shift that. And I guess my question is if you have any other best practices for unaffiliated schools, companies, community centers, and how we can kind of pool together our network resources to be better at recycling, giving materials to people who need it, etc. I mean, it's 120 degrees. Some places have air conditioning, but the manpower is another thing. Working in that heat, not everyone is willing to work hard. Recycling clay is a hard job. It's taxing on my body, but I found that some community centers just couldn't pay the hours for the time needed to recycle clay because it took so long in the very dry, very hot climate. That's kind of what I mean.
Well, I think it helps to have like a loudmouth in your community. Yeah. Like I think that often in every sort of grouping or community, there's one person who's sort of like the chatterbox, and they usually know what's going on. And I know that in Sheridan, that was the technician, and he really knew what everybody was using, and then he would often sort of make these suggestions. And honestly, social media is pretty great at that. It just takes one heavy lifter to get it going, right? So I think that that's the trick, is to find that person, right, who that's part of their character.
And I think often it's easy to work on other people's ideas. And I think that's that thing, is like get a loudmouth to get it going. And sometimes you might be the loudmouth, but that might not be your personality. So you might be louder by email than you are by vocalizing. And I think like old school ways of just reaching out to people and saying, I've got this idea. Would you like to help me with it? Works better than I've got an idea. You should do it. Because my whole podcasting career has been, I've got an idea. Would you like to help me with it? And that has worked pretty well. So it sounds like we got time for one more question.
So mine's kind of, I guess, a little more direct and slightly split. One's for you, Julia, and one's kind of for you, Ben. I actually have one of the clam plates. I got to go and see the installation, and it makes you stop and think and ponder. And I got one. And I love it, but I also, every time I stare at it, I think of the amount of lusters that were added and that impact to the environment when we're trying to make a change. And then to you, Ben, I've been listening to your podcast forever and a day, and you used to go and used to travel and go and meet with these artists. And during the pandemic, of course, that changed to Zoom. And I noticed what a difference that made. Yes, you're not getting that face-to-face connection, but I'm also thinking about the impact to the environment where you're not flying, you're driving or doing. And is that something you're planning on keeping, or is that going to change? And I know maybe it's going to stay now because you have a kid, but like, let's say pre-having your child.
She's referring to this show I did where I had all the endangered species of Pennsylvania on these plates, and then behind the drawing it was platinum luster, so that when you looked at your plate, you saw your reflection to put you in with the species. It was 2 large bottles of luster, which is a lot, and also not. And honestly, you got to pick your battles. Like, do I think that those plates have had as much impact as that luster? I have no idea. Would I do that project again? Probably not. So I think it's just like this continuous learning curve. Like the urns I'm making now, I'm not glazing them at all. So I think that you kind of, I didn't know as much then. So I think it's a really good point, well taken, and absolutely, it's a good, like, who knows, right? I think that as we get more information, we can make changes.
Yeah, and follow up. It's true, Julia. It's also, I come back for food, but once in a while I buy the eggs that are just from Manitoba, and I'm in Quebec. That's a low while to get eggs because they're on special, and that week I have to so that's part just like knowing. And then when you make that decision of doing something that might be in tune with your value at the moment, but it's like, and you know why, like that reflection was important in a piece for the meaning. So I take on that responsibility. And I think it's for many social issues and what's going on in the world right now, as soon as you acknowledge and you take on responsibility for who you are and how you stand, it helps. So
yeah, that conscious consumption is an interesting idea. That it's about having the awareness to make choices. Yeah, because I think environmentally it's the choices I wasn't thinking about that were making the worst impact, and travel is one of them. You know, like my most quote unquote successful year as an artist, I was traveling internationally teaching. Worst environmental year by far, hands down. Like anytime you get on an international flight, your carbon emissions are going way up. And I was doing that a lot, thinking that I was being successful. Like I thought that was a pinnacle in some way. But the pandemic saved me from myself in a way. Because what it did is it taught me that actually digital communication can be as relevant with way less environmental impact. So I don't think the only time I travel now is for interviewing folks that are old enough that they don't relate to the Zoom platform, which is happening more and more. I think there's some fear around Zoom that if they're uncomfortable, I will go to them.
That makes sense. That's you accommodating the person you're interviewing.
What's interesting is talking about travel as part of our exhibition. You know, when we were planning it, one of the things was like we have to be transparent about the sustainability of this exhibition. So we actually had a student work with one of our artists, and they developed a graphic that showed using one of the many calculators that's out there, our carbon footprint for the exhibition. And it wasn't shipping, it wasn't ground travel, it was air. And we were able to then map where everyone was coming from. And then, of course, that forces us to kind of think about, well, then what's the decision now? Do we only have regional conferences, you know? And it goes back again. It created more questions than we had answers to. But we were also here, and we're also here today speaking to you all about this. So it's like, what is it worth it? I think so, you know?
Our last question.
Thank you for this discussion, and kind of piggyback on what you're just saying about kind of individual action versus maybe pushing something more on a policy level. Curious how you see transformation happening. There's a Detroit activist, Grace Lee Boggs, that says, "Transform yourself to transform the world." But we also know that our individual impact is like a 0.00000000001% impact. So that can get pretty disheartening when you see at a much larger scale these things shaping our world. So how do you be an advocate or an activist on an individual level, but also on a policy level?
We could have a panel on that question.
Yeah, definitely.
Because ultimately you're right. I mean, part of the history of the environmental movement is that in the 70s, major oil companies started promoting the idea that environmentalism was an individual choice. And there were massive PR campaigns that hundreds of thousands of dollars were publicized to the public, in the US at least, that actually it wasn't Exxon's problem, it was your problem. And if you were a good environmentalist, you would change your life to then change everything else. And that is true. You know, like we can individually make this. But if we can work with politicians to put pressure on Exxon or other, I mean, there's so many corporations I could list right now. Exxon is just a placeholder. But if we can encourage through our democratic process politicians to put pressure on corporations, policy changes can make a tremendous change here. And I think a smaller level of that is your institution. How do you change a policy at the institutional level?
I think another strategy is very much what we're doing at NCECA is if we are prioritizing it at this event where we're connecting with distributors and then starting to loop in other groups, then that conversation is being had more often. You know, my primary field is in healthcare, and a lot of the times the way we get funding for burn care specifically is actually through Department of Defense funds. You know, we loop research opportunities through something that already exists. And it's being able to connect where are those opportunities that already exist and how do we tie in our work.
I would also just add that I wouldn't underestimate the power of a person like Greta, right? Or Rachel Carson's, who wrote the Silent Spring. You know, those two people have had more impact on thoughtful environmental decisions than I will in my entire life. So I wouldn't underestimate the power of the power of one person, some young woman sitting in another country saying, no, she changed just a tremendous amount. So I think we can do it.
Yeah, and the community, like I got hired to be a program coordinator at school, and they're changing a lot, but they didn't recycle clay. It's horrific, but the students ask for it. Like I received, when I got in the job, I received all the complaints from students, and students were like, this is wrong. And that made me feel good because they were asking for a change. So I think within the community, and I'm like the optimist, like through teaching and like having this conversation, I think we can do this in a sense, I'm a real big fan of Karen Barad and meeting the universe halfway. It's that diffraction. It's like that drop. We're all connected in a ways, and it ripples out. So it's I think it's possible. Of course, some days hard, and like it's not every day, and sometimes we can't always be always close to our values, but I would say just start small and talk about it, I think.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This will be the end of this presentation. We'll all be around, so feel free to come up and ask questions, especially of the Green Task Force members. And they encourage you to get involved with the task force, which has a booth downstairs. So you can hurry down, get involved with them. So thanks for coming.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing, everybody.
I'd like to thank Julia, Che, and Marianne for being a part of this discussion, as well as the audience who had great questions that added to our discussion about sustainability. If you're interested in becoming a member of the NCECA Green Task Force, you can get in touch with them through ncecagtf.com. Also wanted to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our network website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.